The threat of the emerald ash borer beetle, the potential of a new commercial beekeeping program. It's time to check in with our Ontario hubs and find out what they've got for us this week. So, joining us now from our studio at Confederation College in Thunder Bay, Ontario, John Thompson in our Northwestern Ontario hub, and via Skype from Western University in London, Ontario, Mary Baxter in our Southwestern Ontario hub, and here in our studio in the capital city, Jan Jagannathan, our Ontario hub's field producer. Hubmeisters, good to see you all again. Thanks for joining us tonight. And John, I want to start with you because this has been really quite a tough week for Thunder Bay. On the Indigenous file, on the political file, on the policing file. Bring us up to date if you would.
It's true, Steve. Saturday, 21-year-old Dylan Munius's body was discovered in the Nebeng-McIntyre floodway that runs through the middle of the city in Thunder Bay. He is the latest of several young Indigenous peoples to be found dead in that river. Most notably, earlier in May, you may remember there were 2 teenagers whose bodies were found within 11 days. Monday, the mayor, Keith Hobbs, resumed his duties. He's been off for a couple of months after being charged with extortion and obstruction. He was back on Monday, and council was to have voted on motion condemning Senator Lynn Bayak, who made a statement regarding Indigenous people that they ought to trade in their their status cards for citizenship. That has been more or less universally condemned throughout Northwestern Ontario. Hobbs told APTN that he was going to vote in support of asking the senator to step down, and he changed his vote at the last minute. That was the deciding vote, and it failed. While that was going on, the OIPRD was in town, who is conducting an investigation into systemic racism in Thunder Bay's police force. 200 people were at that meeting, and they committed to more public meetings, including meetings with Thunder Bay's homeless population, and to discuss their relationship with the police there. On Tuesday, council held a meeting that was a pre-budget consultation. They were unable to get quorum for that. And then Wednesday, the body of another man was pulled out of the river. Police on the scene performed CPR successfully, and we now understand that he is resting stably. But it has been a difficult week in Thunder Bay. We're back to square zero.
Okay, all things we're going to be following up in the weeks ahead. Thanks for that, John. Mary, I want to go to you now, and we're going to talk about the Beatles, but we're not going to talk about John, Paul, George, or Ringo. We're going to talk about the emerald ash borer. Let's start by just having you tell us what that in fact is.
It's Steve, it's a tiny little beetle that originated in the Far East, and it's emerald, as its name would suggest, and its larvae live underneath the bark of ash trees, and they eat the wood underneath the bark, and the little channels that they make prevent nutrients and water from going from the roots of an ash tree up to the leaves and kills the tree.
And why are people so worried about this?
Well, there's a number of different reasons, but I think one of the big ones is that there's no real practical way to deal with this insect in the forest, in nature. And one study that they did in Michigan, in a forest there, showed that 99% of the ash trees in the forest were killed by this beetle. So here in Ontario, researchers have told me that there's about 10% of the forest will be ash, but in places like southwestern Ontario, that number or that amount has gone up to about 90% in some cases. So that's a big amount of our forest cover, and those ashes support a lot of other life in the forest too. So there's a big concern about what happens next, and in terms of supporting all that other life.
So this is an invasive species that has now come to the province of Ontario, first at Windsor, and is now making its way north. What did authorities try to do to stop it?
Well, it arrived in Windsor 15 years ago now. It took them some time to try to figure out what it was. Nobody knew at first. And once they did, they figured that they would borrow from forest firefighters' tactics by creating a fire break. And what that meant was developing a zone that was ash-free, completely free of ash trees between Essex and Chatham, Kent. They already had some precedent in using this. It was a tactic that they'd used in trying to control the Asian longhorn beetle, which had been coming into some urban areas in the United States. And they thought that this beetle, like the other one, would be slow moving and that this would be a way to halt it. But unfortunately, it didn't work. About a year and a half after they established the ash-free zone, they found it 50 miles west of London in Dutton. And the year after, it showed up in London, and the year after that, it showed up in Ottawa.
Now, this is one of these examples where a phenomenon that started in southwestern Ontario, John, I'll go to you now, is actually being experienced in northwestern Ontario as well, as this is one way the parts of the province speak to each other. How is the city of Thunder Bay dealing with its beetle problem?
The emerald ash borer was first discovered in Thunder Bay in June of 2016. So council has passed a 10-year, $6.3 million plan to eradicate or to treat the trees. Sorry, and that's only going to cover a third of the trees. Most of the younger trees they're going to allow to die, but ash covers 1 in 4 of Thunder Bay's entire tree canopy.
Now, obviously, it's going to be colder up north, John, and I wonder whether or not the beetle can withstand the colder temperatures.
Well, interestingly enough, they're finding that it might actually make the cycle of infestation longer because they're boring deeper under the bark because to withstand the harsher winters. So they haven't said that conclusively yet, but their current hypothesis is it could actually be longer than 10 years.
Mary, any sense about what percentage of the forest lands in this province could eventually be affected by this thing?
Well, I think right now it's something like 250,000 hectares. It's a land area that's equivalent to maybe 3 times the size of Toronto. So if you think of that, if that we were all ash, that's what's affected right now. This has the potential of going anywhere. I mean, it's gone to Quebec. We've seen it in Thunder Bay. And of course, the concern is that it's going to spread out west where they have even more ash trees.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks to you two for that. Stand by. We're going to come back to you with something else in a few moments. But Jan, I want to get you in here because you went to Niagara College to visit the beekeeping program, which is going to graduate its first students this year. Let's take a little bit of a look at your work and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
These students are the next generation of beekeepers in Ontario. They are the first to go through Niagara College's commercial beekeeping program, the only one of its kind in Eastern Canada.
They started off in the first term in January, really learning the foundations, so honeybee health, entomology of bees, ecology of pollinators, and then the second term, which ran in the spring and summer, was really hands-on, so getting in the hives as much as possible.
It's actually really crazy that you can't keep a beehive alive in a lot of parts of Ontario because the environment's too toxic.
Yikes. Who wants to be a beekeeper?
It's an interesting question. You know, I think about, do you remember being asked what you wanted to be as a child? You know, the usual answers are, for me, I can say scientist, an astronaut, a firefighter.
Hockey player.
Basketball player maybe. But, you know, beekeeper wasn't on the list, and it wasn't on the list for these students as well. There's various reasons as to why they joined this program.
Such as?
And they tell me one of the biggest reasons is it's just bees have been in the news for so long, whether it's the bee population declining, whether it's varietal honey, they just want to get into it. One of the most interesting ones, one of the students, they told me she didn't know anything about beekeeping. She didn't know anything. All she knew was she liked honey on her toast and with some peanut butter, and she knew that bees liked flowers. And that was enough for her to jump into this. And now she has 50 hives in her backyard, and she wants to get into pollination service.
Well, is there more to beekeeping than just, making them ripe for honey?
There's a lot more than just honey. I think people have that misconception that honeybees is just honey. In Ontario, we have the largest amount of beekeepers in Canada, but we only produce about 8 to 10% of the honey in Canada. So a lot of the service is pollination services. So people don't realize beekeepers load their bees onto a truck, send them off to a farm, get those the farmers get their crops pollinated. One of the biggest benefiters is New Brunswick. Those blueberries that we eat during the summertime, they're pollinated from our Ontario bees. Huh. So that's one of the biggest. You have bee production with queen breeding, you have wax, of course you have soaps, and of course you have honey. So.
Did you get stung?
I did. Right
Did
there.
you really?
I did indeed.
You got stung on that shirt.
It hurt. First time I ever got stung. Wasn't allergic, but it hurt.
Talk about taking one for the team.
I did. There you go.
Well done, Jane. All right. Thank you very much. Hubmeisters, we're going to finish up on this because throughout the summer, on our website, tvo.org, we've been writing about the history of various foods that are distinctively Ontarian. And at the end of the series, we created, you know how they do this for the basketball playoffs in the States, the NCAAs? We did a bracket and let people vote on what is the most quintessentially Ontario food. And the final round was pea meal bacon invented in Toronto against the Persian, which comes from Thunder Bay. And the results, the Persian won in a landslide. And here are some of the Facebook posts that are trying to rally the Persian vote when it was up against butter tarts in the semifinals. Sheldon, we can bring these up. Civic pride is on the line, folks. Help support Thunder Bay in the great Ontario food fight. Go Persian. Here's another one. Vote for the Persian, a tasty product made right here in Thunder Bay. And another one, vote Persian. Butter tart is a tough opponent, but we are confident in our hometown treat. Well, clearly there was a lot of protecting the home turf that was involved here. John, you've had them, I've had them, but a lot of people haven't had them. So let's start with this. What's a Persian?
Well, this is a Persian. It's kind of a donut in a cinnamon bun style. We got kind of a raspberry sugary topping on top of that. And up until just recently, you could only get this in Thunder Bay. And a great deal of what they produce in Thunder Bay is actually exported. They put the sugar on the side because people are traveling with these to bring them elsewhere. That's how big they are.
And of course, the best part about them is absolutely no calories whatsoever, right?
Yeah,
not exactly. Not exactly. No, that's like 5 meals worth of calories right there. When the word went forth in Thunder Bay that we were having this contest, how much hometown pride was at stake getting people out to actually support the hometown treat?
Well, that's the thing about Thunder Bay is that its civic pride is fierce. And so what we saw here was similar to what we saw in a CBC poll a few years back in which they tried to look at the 7 wonders of Canada. And the sleeping giant, this rock formation that looks like a sleeping giant across the bay, got 177,000 votes next to the closest 81,000. And it was similar in this case. The commercial radio stations were pushing it, tons and tons of media, social media shares. I think there were about 200, most of them generous to Persians. And when people in Thunder Bay see Persians up against butter tarts, what they really see is butter tarts up against Thunder Bay.
Okay, Mr. Director, can I get a 3-shot here? Because I want to know how all these people voted. John, you voted for the Persian, obviously, right?
You better believe it.
Okay, Mary, who'd you vote for?
Windsor Pizza, of course.
Windsor Pizza. Well, of course, you got to do the Southwestern Ontario thing. Jan, who did you vote for?
It's the butter tart.
You voted for the butter tart?
Mm-hmm.
That feels somehow disloyal to our good friend John, don't you think? John, oh my gosh, John, you're making me so jealous right now eating that thing. FYI, I never tell anybody ever who I vote for, but I did vote for the Persian this time. I did. I've had them. They're just phenomenal. Well done, Hubmeisters.
Thanks you.
Indeed, indeed. Thanks for joining us, Hubmeisters, and we'll do it again next week. John Thompson, Mary Baxter, J.N. Jagannathan.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.